The American people, through the democratic process, had an opportunity in 1932 to change political leadership. And let's see what they did in that dramatic year of 1932, right in the depths of the Great Depression. There's a national election, and in 1932, President Hoover faced great odds as he tried for re-election. There's great misery from the Depression. And remember an earlier lesson where we had some details about just how bad things were by 1932. Compounding that was a very gloomy outlook or attitude that President Hoover had the misfortune of seeming to reveal everywhere he went, and every time he spoke, he just seemed so down and gloomy. Even his cabinet members indicated that when you went to see him, to talk to him in the Oval Office, it was, one of them said, it's something like taking a bath in ink. That would suggest to you not a very pleasant experience. Compounding his woes, in the summer of 1932, veterans from World War I organized what they called the Bonus Army and went to Washington, D.C. to ask the Congress and the President to vote a bonus that Congress had promised to give the veterans, but in the 1940s. Give it to them now, 1932. They were desperate. They needed money. So they went to Washington by the thousands to petition and ask the Congress to act now. But unfortunately, the President and the Congress are going to say, well, no, we can't do it now. And then the President's going to send in the Army under Douglas MacArthur, and excessive force is going to be used, and General MacArthur is going to make a really unbelievable statement about how he had thwarted a revolution in America. That was not the case at all. When the veterans heard the bad news that the bill had been voted down, they sang on the steps of the Capitol, "God bless America." Well, that's not the stuff of revolutionaries. But the whole Bonus Army fiasco and the suppression of those veterans in the summer of 1932 just made the re-election of Herbert Hoover much more unlikely. Now, this seems to open the door for Democrats, and the Democrats were eager. They had won in the off-year elections of 1930, big gains in the House and Senate and in the governor's mansions of the states. Many would seek the nomination. Many Democrats want that victory. In fact, we'll see, I've got a little heading on our graphic here, that the Democrat donkey could have won in 1932. You just had to get the nomination and you looked like a shoo-in. Al Smith very much wanted the opportunity to run for the Democrats for president in 1932. He had run in 1928 and had lost, but he knew this could be his year. But the Democrats have other options, and one very strong candidate almost from the very beginning in the nominating process was Franklin Roosevelt of New York. He had in 1930 run for the governorship for re-election and had won by a 700,000 vote majority in New York. In 1928 he had run for the governorship the first time and had won, very close race, 25,000 majority vote then. But in 1930 he made himself a national figure and a potential presidential candidate with this huge sweep in New York with some 700,000 popular votes. In 1932 at the convention, he enjoyed the support not only of sort of the normal political leaders, but he had two individuals who were making their weight felt in the Democrat Party, and that included Joseph P. Kennedy and William Randolph Hearst. Both will come out in favor at the convention of Franklin Roosevelt and work behind the scenes to try to help get him nominated. And indeed, in 1932, we'll see that Franklin Roosevelt had won the nomination on the fourth ballot. It took 4 ballots because to be nominated in those days took a 2/3 vote of the delegates. Not a simple majority, but a 2/3 vote. Let's get a picture of our candidate now. Let's go over to our slides and take a look at Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. In a little bit we'll look and see he'd suffered from polio, but in this picture it shows a very vigorous and strong person. Franklin Roosevelt was eager to get into his campaign. But let's first take a look at Franklin Roosevelt. Who was he? First, you see by the little symbol on the left, the Empire State Building. He's from the state of New York, again, governor of New York. He had been born to wealth in the Hudson River Valley, and as a young man had attended and graduated from Harvard, and then had attended Columbia Law, where later he took the exam for law and became a licensed lawyer in the state of New York. And then at a very young age, he ran for the state Senate. And really, to everyone's surprise, Franklin Roosevelt won that state Senate race. He wasn't supposed to, he wasn't favored to, but he had won. And fortunately for him, Woodrow Wilson's administration was looking for a New Yorker, and they named Franklin Roosevelt Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the Wilson administration. And so let's take a look here at just what's happening in his career at this stage. First, let me go to slides. We see Roosevelt, but let's move out here and let's take a look at Roosevelt in his days as a cabinet member. And you see the tall man in the background. That is Franklin Roosevelt, young man serving in Wilson's cabinet during his term. Just prior to his going to Washington, around 1905, we find that the future president had married Eleanor. She was a Roosevelt before she married Franklin. She was a distant cousin. And she's going to have really a lot to say and a lot of influence on Franklin Roosevelt later on in his career. Now, let me give you a little more of the information about him. In 1920, at the end of Wilson's second term, Franklin Roosevelt is going to be nominated for the vice presidency with James Cox as the presidential nominee, and he's going to run for president, vice president in 1920. The Cox-Roosevelt ticket will lose badly to Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. Shortly after that run for the vice presidency, Franklin Roosevelt suffers polio, and that disease is going to leave him partially paralyzed. The disease of polio is going to take him out of politics for about 7 years. In a way, one could argue if he had to be ill for a period of time, maybe the 1920s was a good time, because it was a thoroughly Republican decade. In this illness, Roosevelt is forced to look at the world quite differently. Prior to this, he was born into wealth. He had a very easy, very comfortable life. This disease woke him up. Life can be tough. And Roosevelt had the good sense to say, now wait a minute, I'm Franklin Roosevelt. I've got all this money. I can be taken care of. I can hire doctors and nurses around the clock. What if I were Joe Smith? And what if I didn't have this wealth? What happens to me? What happens to my home and my family? And it didn't take much calculation to figure out most people would be totally devastated. Perhaps families would be broken up. And it begins to plant the seeds in the mind of Franklin Roosevelt that there's perhaps more government ought to be doing to protect people when they're just overwhelmed with a catastrophe such as this and they don't have private wealth. Also, as he's recuperating, he is something of a student. And here you begin to see, I think, the real influence of Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was a lady who had been a worker in the settlement houses in New York. In fact, she worked in the Henry Street Settlement House as a young lady. She is very much in tune with social reform. And in the 20s, when her husband is recuperating, she brings some of her friends to Hyde Park and walks into Franklin Roosevelt's study and says, I want you to meet someone, a friend of mine, and introduce them. And there's Franklin Roosevelt in his wheelchair. He can't go anywhere fast. And she says, I'll be back in a little while. And she'll leave these new visitors there talking to Franklin Roosevelt about social issues. And so Eleanor and her friends have a chance to really make Franklin Roosevelt more sensitive to issues that he really hadn't paid much attention to when he was a young, vigorous person and had not gone through this illness of polio. And we also begin to see something, and I think we can go back here to Eleanor. We begin to see, as I said, a bigger role for Eleanor. Eleanor Roosevelt is going to be a woman who will influence the thinking of Franklin Roosevelt, but I think it becomes